Hello, everyone. I'm Ralph, a software engineer here at Genesis, and I would like to share in this dev drop how to use Amazon API Gateway to invoke Genesis Cloud APIs. And this is part 4, REST API with proxy integration. In the part 2 of this dev drop, I have discussed the difference between the HTTP API and REST API, where REST API is much more feature-rich compared to the HTTP APIs. And we can go back to that article actually, where most of the differences uh, is more on the flexibility. And I'd like to highlight it on the characteristics or on the development of the API gateway, which is actually here on the request validation, the request parameter transformation, and the request body transformation, which allows you to manipulate the request before it is being sent to the backend service. And other than that, you have much more features in managing the API, authorization, security, monitoring, and with the integrations, which makes it much more expensive compared to the HTTP API. And in particular, with the request manipulation, we have two types of integrations, which is the proxy integration and the non-proxy integration in the REST API. For proxy integration, it is very similar to the HTTP API, where um, the request of the client is just being passed through to the API gateway without any manipulation to the backend service like the Genesis Cloud APIs. Meanwhile, for the non-proxy integration, it utilizes the flexibility of the REST API features, which I've said the request validation, request parameter transformation, request body transformation, and other features, wherein the client sends the request to the API gateway, and you can set it up to do some transformation manipulation to the data before it is being sent to the backend service, like the Genesis Cloud API. So in this part of the video, we'll just be discussing how to set up REST API with proxy integration, which is similar to how we did in the previous video with the HTTP API. So let's go to the API gateway again on the AWS console management. We already have the Genesis HTTP API test here, which we've created previously. So let's create another API, this time the REST API. So let's click build. And um, for the REST API with proxy integration, let's just create something new. Um, let's name it Genesis REST API test. And you can also add some description and the API endpoint type, which is one of the unique features of the REST API. You can choose either edge optimize or private, but for this demonstration, we'll just choose regional. And there we have created our REST API, although since, again, REST API cannot be deployed automatically, we still have to deploy it later once we have configured everything properly. So now we'll just do the same steps that we've done in the HTTP API. So we create the routes and we'll also create the integrations. So for the first step, we'll create the routes, or it's called resources here in the REST API. Um, So here, since what we're going to be doing is a proxy integration, we'll just pass everything from the API gateway to the Genesis Cloud API. We'll enable the proxy resource. And the resource path is the base one since we haven't added anything yet. And we just want this to be dedicated to the Genesis COD API. So we'll just leave it like this. And let's add the proxy plus here in the resource name. And you can also configure if you want some course options, but we won't be doing that here. So let's create a resource. And after that, it's been created. Let's go to the any. And as you can see here, there's a warning that there's an undefined integration. So this is where we're going to define the Genesis Cloud API integration. So let's edit it. As you can see, there's a lot of options for you to choose. There's Lambda, there's HTTP, there's mock integrations, a specific AWS service, VPC link, can also do that here, but we'll choose HTTP and we'll use the HTTP proxy integration. And for the method, since we're going to be exposing all of the endpoints of the Genesis Cloud API, we'll just choose any. And then we'll input here our endpoint, which is api.microcloud.com/proxy. So don't forget this one to add brackets, open and close bracket and proxy. And again, please choose the necessary endpoint region that is necessary for your use case. So do change this. And as for the rest of the settings, we'll just leave it as is. You also have additional options here for the URL path parameters, your URL to your string parameters, and URL request headers parameters, but we won't be configuring these since, again, we'll be using proxy integration. So after inputting these things, let's just save it. And with that, everything is okay, actually. We can test the API internally. Let's let's say we can use the get users and the proxy value of like /API/lead2/users. And we can also input some query strings and the headers. For the headers, since the access token is required, let's input it, authorization, and it's separated by colons, so there. And we'll just get the access token that we got from Postman. I think it's this one. And let's paste this, and then we can test it. And as you can see that the API gateway works properly, it receives the response body. And since everything is okay, we can actually deploy this one. In deploying an API for REST API, it is recommended that you should add some stages. So for this one, let's create a new stage and let's say a stage name of test. And then you can just deploy it. You can also add some description if you want, but we won't be adding it since it's optional. So let's deploy it. So once deployed, since it's already successful, you can already see the invoked URL for this one. And then we can test it in Postman actually. So let's copy this one. Let's replace this one with the new one. Like this one. Oh, let's add that one. And then we can also call the same endpoint just to test it. And as you can see, it also returns the same data from the Genesis Cloud API. So basically that's it. It's a very simple thing to do, which is very similar to what we did in the HTTP API, except that we already we did this in the REST API, and you have access to much more features compared to the HTTP API. So you can have authorizers, you can have some model definition, gateway responses, which will be using this in the next part of the video. But yeah, in terms of here on the endpoint, you can have some more options actually and more modifications on what you can do. And you can also test it actually. And yeah, that's how easy it is to set it up here on the REST API with proxy integration. So in the next part, we'll be making a non-proxy configuration with the REST API. So see you guys in the next video.